This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. Welcome to the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast. I'm your host, co-founder, and editorial director of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, Jamie Bogner. My guest on the podcast today, you probably know, you've probably watched him on television, putting an orange slice on the edge of a glass of wheat beer. Dr. Keith Villa of Ceria Beverage, formerly of Blue Moon, and the creator of Blue Moon, right, Keith?
That's right, Jamie. Yeah, thanks for having me on today.
We're down in outside of Denver, Colorado, and Keith's newest venture after leaving Blue Moon has been to launch two breweries, Donovan Brewing, as well as Ceria Beverage, focusing on incorporating THC and CBD into non-alcoholic or de-alcoholized beers. So we've got a fantastic conversation, I think, lined up. We're going to talk about wheat beer. We're going to talk about non-alcoholic beer process. We're also going to talk about infusion and incorporating THC in kind of beers, something we've never talked about on the podcast yet. So I'm really excited about the conversation. Thanks for joining me today, Keith.
Oh, again, thanks so much. And again, we love to pioneer the world of beer. Really stretch that envelope. And I'm sure a lot of your listeners have done the same thing. So we're talking about the same thing here and just having a lot of fun with it.
Cool. Before we get started, as the brewing industry's premier choice for glycol chilling, G&D Chillers has set the standard on quality, service, reliability, and dedication to their customers' craft. For 25 years, G&D has led the way with innovative solutions for the craft brewing industry. Contact G&D Chillers today at 1-800-555-0973 or reach out online at gdchillers.com. Mention the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast and you'll receive up to $1,000 worth of glycol with the purchase of any new G&D Chiller unit. And Tavour is the tastiest way to explore the world from the comfort of your home. Select delicious craft beers on the Tavour app that you cannot find in your area and get them delivered right to your door. It's not a Beer of the Month club where you end up with duds you have to give to your grandpa. Download the free Tavour app today and get $10 in beer money with code BREWING. All right, so we're here right before GABF week takes over Denver and everything gets absolutely crazy. I'm sure you've got a bunch of friends coming in town, Keith.
I do. It's amazing how big GABF has gotten. I mean, in the early days, I started judging in 1993, and I think I went to my first one, back in the 80s. And it went from almost nothing where people didn't know about it or didn't want to go. They had an excuse to not go, to today where everybody is clamoring for tickets.
It's pretty impressive. Let's talk a little bit, about some of your history in beer. Obviously, you've got a storied history helping create Blue Moon or creating Blue Moon, turning it into a thing, helping Coors turn it into a brand that's now as a single brand as large as most other craft breweries as their own standalone. Talk to me a little bit about how you got interested in beer. In a couple of minutes, how we got to this point today where you are.
Yeah, so I'll try to stick to the elevator speech here because over the course of a 33-year brewing career, there's a lot of interesting stories along the way. But I got started. Initially, I was a molecular biology student up at the University of Colorado in Boulder, and I was planning to become a medical doctor, pediatrician, and so I was geared up to go to medical school, the CU Health Sciences Center, and somewhere along the way, as I was doing research in the molecular biology labs, Coors was looking for somebody to do brewing research up at the Golden Brewery, and I saw this big ad where they were looking for a brewing researcher, and I was a home brewer at the time because for a lot of your listeners that may not know, the Brewers Association was started and is currently headquartered in Boulder, Colorado, right near the CU campus, and in those early days, I remember they would hand out pamphlets about learn how to brew, and they really touted what back then was called microbrewing. So they had home brewing and microbrewing, and microbrewing eventually became what we now know as craft brewing. But I learned how to homebrew, and it really fascinated me. So when I saw that advertisement for Coors, I went and talked to them, and I was the most qualified. So I'd co-authored a couple of articles as an undergrad, and so I decided I would start there and change career paths And I thought, I'll do this for 1 or 2 years, and if I like it, I may stick around here. If not, I'm going to medical school. So I was there for a couple of years. And
you took off to Europe at some point here, right?
Well, after 2 years, I told the folks at Coors that I loved doing this type of research. It was just fascinating because working on the brewing process and on yeast and fermentation, it was fascinating. And so I told them I was going to quit and go to Boulder to get my PhD in biochemistry. And of course, they said, well, what if we send you to Belgium to get your PhD in brewing? And I, as a young guy, said, this is awesome. And it turned out that the director of research back then at Coors was a gentleman named Finn Knudsen, and he was very good friends with the professor of brewing at the University of Brussels. And the professor actually had an opening when I was available. So it was really a case of being in the right place at the right time. And and at that time I had been dating my wife for, 8 years, I think. And so we decided to get married, and Belgium would be our honeymoon. And so we got married, headed to Belgium, and I started working on my PhD over there. And
is this where the wheat beer kind of bug hit you?
Exactly, yeah. And of course, I was there from 88 to about 92. And this was long before Belgium became known as this beer mecca for so many beer lovers. So it was really unspoiled back then, and it was cool because you could go to a lot of the breweries and talk to the brewers and really see how they did things in the old days versus today. Today, it still is a fascinating country to go to in regards to beer, but it's been kind of developed for the tourism industry, so you see a lot more things that are romantic and fanciful, whereas in the old days you actually talked to the brewers who were these men and women getting dirty, and you heard their stories, and it was just so again, to me, the word that sticks out is fascinating, because it was just historic, it was just fun. And so I was there for quite some time, and for me, one of the best parts was actually going with my professor to consult. Well, he was the consultant, and I was learning how to consult and how to fix problems that a lot of breweries had. And we would go, for example, to the Duvel Mortgott brewery, and they would typically have maybe 6 to 10 problematic beers on a table, and we would taste each one, and my professor would calibrate his palate with a Dunhill cigarette in his left hand and a cup of coffee on the right hand, and he would take a puff, take a swig, and that was the way he calibrated. And he was really good at picking up the beer, smelling, tasting once more, and then telling them what they needed to do to fix that problem for that particular batch. Or he would describe what the issue was, so that they could avoid any problems in the future. Mm-hmm. And so I learned a lot from those visits, not just to Duvel Mortgott, but to a lot of the lambic breweries, the sour breweries, the sour red breweries in Flanders, the Trappist breweries, even the big breweries. The predecessor of AB InBev was small. Well, it was in those days a 1 million barrel a year brewery called Interbrew. They were the biggest in Belgium, and they're the ones who really became aggressive and ended up purchasing Anheuser-Busch to form AB InBev. And those folks, they're great brewers, and in Belgium they had the two biggest brands. The biggest brand of beer in Belgium in those days, and even to this day, is a brand called Jupiler. It looks like Jupiter, but it's actually an L. Sure. And it's a delicious beer if you're in the mood for a good Euro Pils. Right. I really like that one.
So tell me about, you came back to the United States. You came back to Coors. Mm-hmm. They paid for you to study and get a degree in brewing there. How did this whole Blue Moon thing come about then?
Yeah, so it was about 1994 that I got funding to start what became Blue Moon Brewing Company. And back then, the largest selling craft beer brand, or microbrewed brand, if you look back in history, was George Killian's Irish Red. It was a huge brand, selling back then at about, I think the equivalent was maybe 500,000 barrels or something like that. And for specialty beer back then, it was a big brand. They also had at Coors a new product called Zima, And this was the first of these.
They were so far ahead of their time.
It was the flavored malt beverages.
Yeah.
And so they had two successful products that were new and innovative on their hands. And so they didn't really want to give me a lot of funding for Blue Moon. And especially since it was a completely new type of product. Belgian beer was something that was not really popular back in the early 90s in the States. Jeff Liebisch up in Fort Collins, he had some really great tasting Belgian-style beers he had made, but of course his bread and butter beer that brought in the money was Fat Tire, which was a classic American amber ale. Then of course on the East Coast, Rob Todd had Allagash that had just opened up, and he was making his white, which was great. Who else? And of course, Pierre Celis down in Texas, Austin, Texas, I believe it was. He opened his Celis brewery, and he was trying to push Belgian beer, but there was really nothing that cut through the clutter to tell the American beer drinker that, hey, here's Belgian beer, it's awesome. And I was taking a big gamble back then to make our flagship beer a Belgian white, which is a style that was, again, almost unheard of in 1994, 1995. And I put it all together, and we started brewing the first batches of Blue Moon back then in 1995. Launched on, September 14th, 1995. And by that time, I had been a home brewer for quite a number of years, and I had passed my BJCP exams, and so I've got a nice low number in the BJCP system. And I was just into beer back then. I loved just the history and the styles and everything you could do with beer. So I launched Blue Moon, and I saw right away that it was an uphill battle because so many stores took it in because it was this new product from Coors.
Right.
And so just on the Coors name, they took us in. But it didn't take more than about 3 months to get discontinued in a lot of stores, Safeway, Kroger, you name the store, and we were being discontinued because nobody bought it. And myself, I went to the stores quite often to check on the products and, twist the bottle so the label was facing toward the consumer, and just because I was proud of it. And,
Sure.
And to this day, I still am. But back then, I'd see it discontinued, and I was thinking, oh my gosh, this thing is going to die. And
how much was that early first production run to see how this thing would work?
Gosh, in the early days, first year could have been somewhere around 6,000, maybe 7,000 barrels for the Eastern Coast, and it was really hard because, like I said, we'd get discontinued, and I tried everything I could to keep the brand alive. It was tough, but eventually. Oh, and then I created the orange garnish back then. People are very familiar with Corona and that lime garnish, so that was popular back then. But most bars did not carry oranges, so I had to get bars to carry oranges, and the whole impetus of that was that I had traveled around the markets where Blue Moon was for sale, and I noticed that there were a few bars that were serving it. Of course, not a lot of bars served it, but the few that did, most of them topped it off with a slice of lemon. And of course, the recipe says it's brewed with Valencia orange peel and coriander, and so I asked the bars to put an orange garnish on it, and they said no because they didn't have any. And so I had to think of a way to get a cheap way to get them to serve oranges. And so I got bags of oranges and took them to the different accounts and picked out strategic ones where I knew they did a lot of sales, and I knew it was a good brand for them because they had a certain clientele that just fell in love with the taste. So I picked those, gave them oranges to grow the brand even more. And I called it a hub and spoke model, where it was a hub, popular pub there, and then as it grew in sales, then I would spoke out to other bars that served Blue Moon, and I would just say, look, the original one there is doing a fantastic job just by putting the garnish on. And so they'd say, oh, I'll try it, and they did it, and of course it worked. And the sales of Blue Moon started picking up. Let's see, that was 1997 that I did that.
Let's talk about that a little bit more, because I think that idea of ritual around beer is something, again, that Belgium, with proper glassware and with a pouring process, has really built into a kind of drama around that. But before we do that, with over 200 years of combined experience in the craft beverage industry, Country Malt Group's dedicated sales and support staff understand the importance of excellent ingredients, product knowledge, and expertise in making great beer. Country Malt Group's mission is to provide the products and services you need while making the process of ordering ingredients easy. The focus is to inspire your best craft. Order online at shop.countrymalt.com. And balancing barley and hops is your expertise, and for Clarion Lubricants, food-grade lubricants is theirs. The team at Clarion knows that when it comes to making great beer, you're the expert, and when it comes to supplying food-grade lubricants backed by service-oriented professionals, they're the experts. Clarion will work with you to create an efficient lubrication program that helps protect your brewery. To speak with an expert, dial 1-855-MY-CLARION. That's 855-692-5274. Or visit clarionlubricants.com. Clarion Lubricants, the expert that experts trust. On that subject of ritual, creating that garnish, putting that lime in a Corona, pouring it into this glass or a proper glassware, or even today now the slow pour pills with the, or the Guinness pour for that matter, pouring it halfway, letting it settle, pouring it again, creates a kind of drama and excitement around beer, and is probably something we don't spend as much time talking about, in terms of its relative importance, in this whole piece. But you kind of tapped into that early on and understood that theatricality and that kind of process creates some attachment among, to specific products, specific beers.
Yeah, it really does. And I mean, it's, for me, critical for craft brewers to come up with some type of ritual for their beer, whether it's their slow pour pills, or maybe they have another beer that has a certain unique ingredient they could top off the foam with. I don't know, but it is something that I think belongs to the craft industry of today. Back then, you're right, the Belgians were really, really fanatical about making sure that whatever beer a pub poured was poured in the correct glassware. And to this day, you could go to any number of pubs in Brussels or in Belgium, and you'll see just this massive amount of various glassware that the bartender has in a specific order. And when somebody orders a certain beer, they pick out the correct glass, pour it in, and then present it to the customer. And I learned that early on, and I tried to apply that to Blue Moon. Let's see, 1997. Actually, at the very beginning, it was just the beer served in a shaker glass. 1997, I created the orange garnish, and in 1998, I got the glass. It's that iconic 22-ounce wheat beer glass. And back then, I remember people said, "This is crazy. 22 ounces. Who's going to drink that much beer? It's just, this is impossible." But we worked hard and got that glassware into accounts across America with that orange garnish, and Blue Moon just took off, and we hit critical mass in about 2001 to 2002, and at that point we couldn't make enough Blue Moon, and just the market had changed, and we were doing just incredibly well.
So at that point, you went from 7,000 barrels in that first year, and now you're a couple million, or.
Yeah, if you look in the papers, you'll see the press reports about 2 million barrels a year of mostly Belgian white, which is to me, a huge success story, because you look at other beer brands, and I think the next closest would be Sam Adams Boston Lager, followed by Sierra Nevada Pale Ale. So there's a lot of volume with Blue Moon Belgian White, and the fact that it's a Belgian-style wheat ale is really important, because to me, when I set out to create it, I didn't want to make an exact copy of a Belgian-style wit. That's why I chose Valencia orange peel, and I used oats, because back then the wits around did not use oats. Most brewers, they loathed brewing with oats because they're very difficult to brew with. But I remember I put a little more than 10% oats in Blue Moon to give it a real smooth mouthfeel. So it was risky. It was hard to brew, but
there is some historical precedence for that in Belgian-style witbiers.
Correct. Yeah,
wasn't out of the blue, but yeah.
Right. The brewers back years ago, they did brew a lot with oats because that was one of the main grains that was on a farm.
Yeah.
But when Pierre Celis kind of brought back the style in the 60s, I believe it was 1964, he chose to leave out oats, so which is wheat, raw wheat and pale malt. And historically it's correct, but over the years the practice had really waned, and so I thought, I'm going to use oats because it's correct and it creates a real smooth, creamy mouthfeel. So I did, and the taste is, similar to a true to style Belgian wit, but unique because it's very bright in the orange character. It has a garnish, an orange garnish, has the smoothness of the oats, and it uses malted wheat. I wanted malted wheat for a little more kind of an orangey color to the beer. If you look, it's kind of a deep golden versus the very pale color of traditional Belgian wits. So for the color, the flavor is similar to traditional wits, but it has some uniqueness which I wanted to put in there. And it's to me it's a great beer.
What's the rough wheat percentage in that?
Oh, it was about somewhere around 30%.
And all malted, no unmalted wheat?
Yeah, again, for the just the taste, you get that real clean malted wheat taste, and you do get some color from it. It's this beautiful kind of an orangish color, and it's hard to reproduce. But to me, that was important to make a wit that was not true to style, but a wit that me and my friends really loved to drink. And if you talk to other Belgian brewers here in the States or back in Belgium, you'll see that they like to put their own, I would say, thumbprint on a certain beer style. Peter Buchart, who was the brewmaster up at New Belgium, he's a prime example of not brewing to style, but making a taste profile that people just love. And Peter, that's what's one thing I really respected about him when he was up at New Belgium, is he didn't brew these true to style beers. Although he's very capable of doing that, he really would kind of push the envelope a little bit and put a flavor in that maybe was questionable, but turned out to be fun and exciting, and people liked it.
Well, that's, and since we're talking about Belgian brewers, I think it kind of speaks to that idea that what we consider true to style, I mean, it's almost a very American process of creating a taxonomy around these things. We create quote unquote styles because we need parameters from which to judge things, because we also like to rate and judge and, again, create more of that hierarchy about that. What we consider beer styles and the way that they're codified is really a recent kind of development, last 30 years kind of development as, again, we try to add a structure to this, but the styles developed describing ranges of commercial beers made by existing brewers. Often that range was broader than the actual style as it was written. But I think it's important to note that styles always follow the innovation of professional brewers in that kind of space. They are not some platonic ideal that existed for all of time that brewers simply strive to achieve. They are descriptive primarily, and it was the innovation of commercial brewers pushing these products in certain ways that have created the concepts and structures of style. Something like double IPA didn't exist really before the early 2000s, when some brewers like, hey, we can make this a little bit stronger, and it's not to style, but now it is a style and considered a judgeable style with its own parameters. And so these things grow, change, they become different things, but it's that innovation that is what drives it from these makers, not this sole idea of striving to match some existing style.
You're absolutely right, Jamie, because a lot of people don't realize that even American light lager, that's a style that popped up here in the States in the 1970s. Miller Lite was the first commercial example that became successful. There were one or two before them that did not end up being so successful, but the advent of the light beers. That is a really innovative American idea. And of course, today, there are a lot of craft brewers who disdain light beer, but it is one of the most difficult styles to make, because if you make any mistakes along the way, they show up like a big sore thumb. And light beer is just that type of style that is thirst quenching, and it is, again, very difficult to make. But it's a true American innovation, as is New England IPA, double IPA. It's so many fantastic styles that are fun to brew and even more fun to drink.
Yeah. So let's get back a little bit to talk about wheat beer a little bit more. So you've come up with this recipe. You've built this thing. From the way that you conceptualize it, what were some of the flavors that you were looking for that you thought might resonate with people? I know you mentioned color, and I think it is a fascinating thing to see that you got an orangier color and then play on that orange on the ingredient, and then also garnish with an orange to kind of carry the full aesthetic through the entire beer. Are there some other elements? Obviously incorporating wheat gives you a nice, strong head retention in this kind of beer. Are there other recipe considerations that you made around those kinds of factors in the beer?
Yeah, of course, for a Belgian white and for New England IPA, cloudiness is essential. So you've got to make sure it's cloudy. And of course, you want to do it as naturally as possible. I know back in Belgium, there were some brewers, I'm not going to name any of them, that would use pectin or other things to really make that cloudiness or haziness as stable as possible.
Wait, Belgian brewers did that?
Yeah. No, there's some...
you're saying Belgian brewers were made hazy as lazy beers over there?
I think you can find them anywhere. And
well, all right.
And
it's not just American hazy IPA brewers, huh?
No. And so from my perspective, I wanted to make sure that Blue Moon was as natural as possible too. I didn't want to add a hazing agent or anything like that. And so it took a lot of work to figure out the right times to keep it in fermenting and then in aging. And actually the right brewing process to maximize the amount of protein and the amount of beta-glucan that's in suspension, the carbohydrate content. Because if you look at Blue Moon under a microscope, you'll see very few yeast cells. Most of that cloudiness is carbohydrate and protein, and it's hard to make it stay in solution. So we came up with a way to keep it in solution through brewing in the mash tun. You definitely have to have quite a few steps in there.
And so your goal is to keep those particles absolutely as small as possible. The larger they are, the quicker they precipitate out. Or what are you doing in order to achieve these kinds of things?
Yeah, you want small particles that stay in suspension, because you're right. The bigger those particles are, the more tendency they have to just fall out of solution and gather at the bottom as kind of a sludge sometimes. And so you've got to go through the brewing steps to make sure that the carbohydrate and the protein are the right size that stay there and stay stable. So once you have that, then you've got a very nice looking cloudy beer with an orange hue to it.
And this is a step mashing process, I'm just going to assume.
Yeah.
Okay.
It definitely needs some steps. You can't do a single infusion and make a fantastic wit beer.
How many? I know you're not going to tell me the temperatures, but how many steps are typically in your step mash protocol?
3 minimum.
Okay.
So yeah, it's difficult, but it's worth it because you have just the right body that you want, the right amount of alcohol, the right head. Because for your brewers out there who, I'm sure most of them know about it, but there are some advanced brewers who sometimes I run into that don't know that just a simple hold at like 60 degrees centigrade for a certain amount of time will maximize head proteins to give you that really nice head on a beer. There's a lot of other brewing steps in there, science that you go through to really make a beer reflect what you want it to be.
So CO2 is also a big part of beer, and that kind of effervescence is also part of the experience. What are some of your carbonation goals? And I imagine you're using kind of normal brewing process in terms of adding CO2, not going through a full-on kind of spunding process, especially if you're working out at a contract brewery like that. But what is that kind of carbonation goal?
So yeah, for your listeners who may not know it, beers that have wheat, anywhere from 25% and up, the wheat really smooths out the flavor of the beer to the point where a beer can taste somewhat flat if it has normal beer carbonation. And normal to me is 2.5, 2.6. So with wheat, you've got to dial it up to have a beer taste crisp when it has wheat in it. So with Blue Moon, I won't say how many volumes it has, but it does have a higher amount than normal, so that it really showcases that wheat. And I think all wheat beers really should have, to me, just the number all throughout there is 3 volumes for wheat to make it taste really refreshing, smooth, good. And to bring out the aroma too, because with that extra bit of carbonation, it'll push out the aromas that are in the beer, and it pushes them out very nicely, assertively, so that you can smell and see what the brewer put in there.
Yeah. Now, coriander obviously is a kind of important spice in wheat beers. I know you had an interesting approach to evaluating different coriander sources and found a lot of difference in in coriander. Talk to me a little bit about making some of those identifications and how even today, as you're making these beers, you work on that kind of sourcing to make sure that it's exactly what you want.
Yeah, so coriander was really tough because in Belgium, the type of coriander they use in traditional wits has a pretty strong aroma of celery. So if you go out there and just smell it, and even smell a Belgian wit that's made true to style, you'll get this hint of celery in the nose, and that's it's correct, and it comes from the coriander. But if you look at coriander, and I'm not an expert in farming and growing coriander, but I've found that there are a couple different types of coriander out there. The one that is rich in celery type aroma, and another one that is, when you grind it up, it's rich in fruity aroma. To me, the main descriptor I give is when you have some of this type of fruity coriander and you've opened up a freshly ground bag of it, is the aroma of Fruit Loops cereal. If you're familiar with that old standby for breakfast, if you go to the store and buy a box of Fruit Loops cereal and just kind of pop open the box for the first time and take a big whiff and smell that smell, that's very similar to fresh fruity coriander. And so that's what I chose for Blue Moon. And that's really one of the keys to making it so fruity. A lot of people back then made fun of it because they said, "Oh, this is a fruit beer, whatever." And but I chose the ingredients really based on quality and based on getting the taste that I wanted in there. And
there's a lot of crossover between coriander and some compounds that appear naturally in hops as well, and certainly that can produce some of those fruitier, impressions in certain hop varieties.
Right. There's, in fact, the main terpene. These flavor-active aromas in the hops and in the coriander are terpenes, and the main terpene in coriander is one called linalool, and that certainly exists in hops. It's and by the way, we'll talk about this in a few minutes, but that terpene actually has some anti-anxiety type of effect in the body, and knowing that, it's one reason that we put coriander into our newest cannabis beer, because that effect of anti-anxiety mixed with THC really makes you relax and after a hard day, and allows you to kind of de-stress. So yeah, to me, linalool is a real important terpene, and all these terpenes that are in the hops, in coriander, in orange peel, you've got limonene. That's the main one, and again, that's a nice anti-stress terpene, and these things are very effective in beers and in cannabis. With beers, I think there's some way that we ingest these beers, and unknowingly we like them. But I'm thinking it might be because of the terpenes. Our body reacts, and we say, "Man, I love that beer, or I love that certain IPA." But I think besides the taste, one thing that we're inadvertently doing is we're saying, "Oh, deep down inside, that beer is making me very anti-stressed, or it's relieving my anxiety, and therefore my body really wants it." And so.
Let's keep on this. We'll come back to the subject of de-alcoholizing beer. But since we're talking about those terpenes, last time I was down here talking with you about this when we were working on our issue on cannabis and beer, you You said something that was really interesting, and you started bringing up the idea of the entourage effect and the way that, as you're starting to talk about here, those terpenes interact both with, with THC and with each other in order to produce an experience that, we have in the world of cannabis, this idea that there is sativa and indica, and that these two different types of cannabis will produce different highs. But THC is pretty much THC. It's as you've mentioned to me before, it was the interaction of the terpenes with that create different experiences of that high. I thought that was a fascinating one. And now you're also raising the possibility that those same terpenes may interact, say, with alcohol in the brain and impact the way that alcohol affects the brain as well?
I would definitely say yes. Again,
more science obviously needs to be done on all of these things, but
further studies definitely have to be done. But if you just look at it, you see, and even talking to people, you hear stories about how certain beers make them really sleepy and relaxed, and other beers may make them feel hungry. They just got to pick up the phone and call Papa John's and get some pizza. But my first, I guess, foray into seeing the power of terpenes was back in Belgium when I was studying. I remember going to a small town where they held the annual hop parade and hop festival. It was their I think it was held every 2 years. But I visited this town called Poperinge in southern Belgium where they grew hops, and that's the first time I had seen what they called a hop pillow. The hop pillow was just a little gunny sack pillow, very small, maybe about 7 inches long, and it's just a teeny pillow that you put underneath your regular pillow, and the purpose is to help you sleep. And I remember asking back then, what how does this work, or what is it? And they did, of course, back then they really weren't into terpenes. What they said is, these things just have worked. People have used them for hundreds of years, and so that's what they do. And so I took that one of those pillows and I tried it, and it smells like hops, but it does work. You put it under your pillow and you just have a nice sleep, and it's almost like a sedative, a natural sedative, definitely non-habit forming, and but it works. And that was my first, the time that I saw, my eyes were open and I saw, there's something more here. And when you look at it a little deeper, you do see that terpenes are quite effective on the human body. And that's why I say work has to be done. We can't just sit here and say, oh, yeah, you take this type of terpene and it'll do that, because all of us are different. And but the general effect is going to most likely be the same, whether it's an anti-anxiety, anti-stress, an energy effect, whatever it is, it's going to be the same. And I think it's dosage dependent, as well as the entourage effect, where you pair that terpene up with some other compound, such as alcohol or THC or CBD, and you get this magnified effect. So it's just really interesting, and we're right on the cutting edge of all that cool stuff that I think 5 years from now, 10 years from now, we'll be taking terpenes with certain cannabinoids, to lose weight, to gain weight, to have a fun time, to be courageous and get out there and give that speech to your company or whatever. We're going to be using these things almost like medicine, I think, in the next 5 to 10 years.
That's kind of fascinating. Talk to me then a little bit. You now have moved into this realm with Ceria Beverage of making beer that legally can't have alcohol in it, but because you are adding soluble THC into the beer itself, and it becomes this, that process. How are you engineering then using those terpenes, that kind of experience that you want to produce, for people that are consuming that beer?
Okay, and for your listeners, I just want to make clear that I didn't get kicked out of Coors for doing something with cannabis or anything like that. I actually, after a 32-year career, I reached what was called the Rule of 85, meaning your years of service plus your age. If it equaled 85 or more and you were 55 years or older, you could walk out the door with your pension, your 401k, your health insurance, all this stuff. And it was just a great way to finish up that career. And my wife and I took a look at the horizon of beer, and we thought, non-alcoholic beer and cannabis beer seem to be something that is going to be exciting in the future. So that's when we started Ceria. We incorporated as just a C corporation in Delaware, and launched in December of 2018 was when our first product was on the shelf. So and we found out right away that you can't mix alcohol and cannabis from a federal perspective, because you can't put anything federally illegal, such as cannabis, into an alcoholic drink. And at the state level, the different state governments that allow legal recreational cannabis prohibit putting alcohol into any product that contains cannabis. So you can't mix those two ingredients. And also, there are a number of other reasons that are, I think, safety and health related. For example, the cannabis plant is smoked, or you take parts of it to help you get relief from nausea. So that's why cancer patients who have heavy bouts of nausea use cannabis so that they don't vomit 100, 300, 500 times a day. But that same reflex of being nauseous after you, for example, have several shots of tequila, and your body needs to get rid of that quickly so you don't get alcohol poisoning. Well, with cannabis, it'll relieve that type of nausea, so you just keep the alcohol in, so the chances of getting alcohol poisoning actually increase if you mix alcohol and cannabis. So that's why, just from those type of reasons, you want to avoid mixing the two. And so that's why another reason why we remove the alcohol. But yeah, so for those people that have never had cannabis, there are some certain things you want to look into before you try to experience it for the first time. And there are some cases of paranoia increasing. So when you mix alcohol and cannabis, and that's why some people might have beer and cannabis, and all of a sudden feel like their heart's racing, they're going to have a heart attack, or just some type of a paranoia that takes hold. Nobody knows why that is exactly, but there are some cases of it, and that's why, again, we're real proponents of making sure you don't mix the two.
That makes sense. So you go through a de-alcoholizing process. For Ceria, your primary product is a beer called Grain Wave, right?
Yes.
And this is a Belgian-style wit, or a newer take on a Belgian-style wit. Certainly not the same beer as Blue Moon, but in the same vein and style. Now, tell me about that de-alcoholizing process. There are different ways to de-alcoholize beer. Some can certainly impact the way that you want to make that beer, because if you're using heat in any kind of way to drive off alcohol, that can have super negative effects on a beer. Talk to me a little bit about how you evaluated various means of de-alcoholizing beer, what you kind of settled on, and how that impacts some of the concerns and process that as you brew that beer that then goes through that de-alcoholizing process.
Okay, you bet. Yeah, for your listeners that are interested in the different ways of making non-alcoholic beer, there are several ways where you can end up with beer that's below 0.5% ABV, which our government currently considers non-alcoholic. So again, anything below 0.5% alcohol by volume is considered non-alcoholic. And partially that reason for less than 0.5% is historically there are some products out there like orange juice and other sugary juices and products that wild yeast will ferment a bit. So there is a small amount of alcohol in things such as orange juice. And so as long as it's below 0.5%, it's non-alcoholic. And so beer, less than 0.5% is non-alcoholic. If it's down to 0.02, that's considered alcohol-free. So if you see the two labels, in general, that's the distinction, is non-alcoholic is less than 0.5, alcohol-free is 0.0. So as I said, there are several ways of making alcohol-free or non-alcoholic beer, one of the classic ways is just to do an arrested fermentation. Arrested fermentation means you make your wort, you pitch it, and then you allow the yeast to ferment for less than 24 hours. For some brewers, it's just a couple hours. For some, it's maybe 8, maybe 10, but definitely less than 24 hours. Then you remove the yeast. And what you're doing is getting the yeast to get in there, ferment a little bit, make some flavor-active compounds. Then you take it out before it gets above, the alcohol gets above 0.5%. The only issue there is that, and it's a major issue, is taste. You have a wort-like taste that really stays in that beer. So you have this grainy, worty character, and there are some beers on the market. If you get that grainy, worty character, then you know for sure that's an arrested fermentation. Another way is to use certain specialty yeasts that don't ferment certain sugars. So, for example, maltose is the main sugar in wort. It's the main sugar that's produced by the enzymes as they break down the starches from the malt or from the barley plant. And so there are some strains of yeast that don't ferment maltose. And so if you use those and try to minimize the amount of glucose that's in the wort, you definitely can get a non-alcoholic beer. But these yeasts, the ones I've looked at, have it's a slight strange ester type of character that's not the traditional that you get in brewer's yeast. Additionally, there are some sour type of notes these yeasts make, and the net result is a beer that I think is close to beer, but you taste these things that you say, well, it's close, but it's not quite beer. And then, of course, another classic way to remove alcohol is to boil it off. There are, cases of brewers in the past who created beers by boiling. But by boiling, the boiling point of ethanol it's around 140 degrees. So you basically cook the beer to get rid of that alcohol. And once it's all gone, then you have an alcohol-free beer. But again, the drawback there is that you cook the beer and end up with some cooked flavors in the beer, which aren't necessarily good. But in the 1990s, the Germans at their brewing school in Weihenstephan, which is right outside Munich, and for those of your listeners that have been to Munich, definitely they've probably heard of Weihenstephan, because Weihenstephan's...
They've only been around for like 600 years or something, right?
Yeah. They're not one of those new type of places. They've been around a long time. They know how to make beer. And so they have a school there, and they found out how to make great tasting non-alcoholic beer in the 90s because what they theorized was that if alcohol boils at 140 degrees, then what happens if you boil it under a vacuum? And sure enough, you apply a vacuum and the boiling point goes way down to somewhere like 60 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's like, you just bring it up to room temperature and all of a sudden the alcohol starts flying off there. And you maintain flavor. You don't cook the beer. And so that's the way we use, because it really maintains a lot of the flavor of the beer. And for us, quality and flavor is really at the top of the list. But that's those are three classic ways.
That requires some specialized equipment that's not there's not a lot of breweries in the United States that are actually using that kind of equipment right now.
Correct. It is very specialized equipment, and it requires a lot of hands-on babysitting, because this stuff is very sensitive. So it's hard to use, and it's expensive equipment. It is pretty much about the cost of buying another brewery. So if you have a brewery and you want to make non-alcoholic beer and you want to use one of these things, you're most likely going to spend about the same amount of money as you did on all your brewing equipment. So they're not cheap, but in my opinion, they're well worth it, because you really get a good flavored beer. And
so how does that work? I mean, I would think that if alcohol, gets volatilized at that kind of temperature, then at that lower temperature, then if you have, say, hops compounds under that vacuum, they might also volatilize at a lower kind of temperature. How do you then think about and design a beer that can work through that process? Are you reducing hot side hops additions? Are you adding more, later on? I mean, what are some of the other recipe considerations that go into that too, understanding that's part of the process?
Well, I think the main word is compensation. You have to compensate for a lot of things. There's a lot of proprietary work we've done to figure out what compounds have to be compensated for, which ones leave, so which ones you have to kind of beef up in the kettle. And but you go through that work, and you do find there are certain ones that if you really increase them, then by the time you remove the alcohol and certain other flavor active compounds, you end up with a really good tasting beer. So
if you overload and make a beer that would otherwise be undrinkable on its own, not going through this process, that it may give you what you want as it comes out the other end of this.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay.
And the only secret I'll give out is that when you de-alcoholize beer, the process of de-alcoholization actually drives up your final IBU. So that's another compensation piece you have to put into place. Is you have to realize you're going to pick up anywhere from a couple to perhaps as much as 10 IBUs. So you have to be careful for that if you're doing a beer that has maybe in the range of 5 to 20, because in that range, that kind of a swing in IBU will definitely affect the flavor. Whereas something like an IPA, that's a pretty minor change, and so the compensation is much less.
Is that just due to concentration that you're driving off some liquid in this process, but not driving off some of those bittering compounds, or?
No, it is actually that boiling under vacuum that does it. It really drives up you start to isomerize more alpha acids than you do just with standard heat boiling from the kettle.
Makes sense.
Yeah, and it really is. It's one of those things that you learn as you do it, and then you just have to compensate. So yeah, for those of your listeners that ever want to make a great tasting non-alcoholic beer, the name of the game is compensating your ingredients
and doing a little bit of their own homework in order to figure out what that is. Sure. So let's, so now you have this non-alcoholic beer, and you are releasing that non-alcoholic beer as its own standalone non-alcoholic brand, through some major chains. You were just out at the National Beer Wholesalers meeting this week and are releasing that out there into the market. But you also, in Colorado and California, then ship that beer to a cannabis packager, right, who then adds a soluble form of THC into that beer in order to produce a beer with some cannabis kind of compounds and effects.
Yeah, that's it exactly. We make the non-alcoholic beer. It's a fully brewed beer. We remove all the alcohol, ship that non-alcoholic base to our co-packer, who then infuses it. So on paper, it's simple. In practice, it's very difficult. But at the end of the day, the co-packer produces our product under our specifications, and then takes it to the dispensaries, because it's a two-tier system. Cannabis is much different than alcohol. Alcohol is highly regulated through a three-tier system. The cannabis world right now is so new that it's only two-tier. So you go directly from the from the co-packer to the dispensary.
Well, let's talk a little bit about this kind of co-packing process. I'm a little bit fascinated by how that works. How something like THC moves from the plant form into a form that has some sort of psychoactive effect. Then how that's built into some sort of system that's soluble and can stay in some even suspension inside of a liquid. Talk to me a little bit about how that process looks. Because you're definitely doing some new work in this realm. Yeah,
so for your listeners who aren't familiar with the cannabis plant, maybe most of them know this already, but cannabis is a cousin of the hop plant. The hop plant is considered, taxonomically, it's a twining herb, meaning that it climbs a twine, whereas cannabis is called an erect herb, meaning it doesn't need twine. It can actually grow straight up without any help. So other than that, these are two cousins in the world of plants. And so in the same way that hops produce those nice aromatic compounds that brewers love so much, cannabis produces compounds that have a lot of aroma, a lot of taste, and have a completely different effect on the human body. In particular, one compound is THC, and that's produced by the cannabis plant in very small organs on the plant called trichomes. So if you look at a trichome under the microscope or up very, very up close, you'll see it's just a very, almost like a hair-like structure. But it's similar to the hop cone on a hop plant, where the hop cone is where all of those flavor-active compounds are centered and concentrated. The trichome on the cannabis plant is where most of the cannabinoids, and in particular the THC, those are located there inside those trichomes. And kind of like the hop plant. Well, the hop plant is much newer to people in terms of beer usage, because it was the Middle Ages that they started hopping beers. Prior to that, it was other spices that were available, or maybe not even spice at all. But in the world of cannabis, the first, recorded usage would be around the year 1000, if I remember correctly. People started realizing that this plant, or at least recorded that it was active in this way. And these trichomes, what people would do was they would consume the trichome, or consume the plant, either by smoking or some other way, and they found that needed to heat it in order to make these things active. And by heating, what they were doing was decarboxylating the THC. So THC exists as an acid. When you heat it, you remove that acid and decarboxylate the compound, and it becomes very active in our bodies. It actually goes right to what are called CB receptors in the body. These receptors are almost like keyholes in a doorknob. And the THC that's activated goes into the keyhole and actually matches and turns and allows us to experience this euphoria or intoxication. And it's not through any other means, such as like alcohol. Alcohol is a general relaxant. It goes into the body. It relaxes your muscles. It's very active because it goes through your blood-brain barrier, and it actually causes some toxic activity that allows us to get buzzed and drunk. Cannabis is the other way, meaning it's THC goes into our system, has its effects, but as far as we know, there isn't any toxic effect. And that's partially one reason I think so many young people are saying, oh, cannabis is healthy, and they're drinking less alcohol and starting to take up cannabis. Well, anyway, back to the story. The THC is in these trichomes, and in the early days, say around the year 1000, people were making products where they would take all the trichomes, scrape them off the cannabis plant into a pile. They'd wet it and form it into small bricks, and the name of those bricks with all the trichomes is called hash or hashish. And then they would take the hash and smoke it, which was just the concentrated trichomes. And in a similar way, if you could imagine taking all the cones off the hop plants and doing something like that, like making beer, it's a very, very similar process.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of parallels. And the interesting part is that both hops and cannabis have these compounds in oil-like form from the plant. So you have to figure out how to get that oil-like plant into the liquid. So for hops, you boil it, and some of those compounds actually go into the liquid. Again, it's the hop compounds are very hydrophobic. They don't want to go into the liquid, but some make it into the liquid, and you get these very, very nice flavors from the hops. And in the cannabis plant, again, they're oily and hydrophobic, so you have to figure out how to get them into the liquid. Unfortunately for us, we really don't brew with the hop plant. And if you did, you would lose a lot of the THC because it does stick to the kettle, the inside of the kettle.
Brew with the cannabis plant?
Yes, with the cannabis plant, yes. Because in my early days, when cannabis became legal in Colorado, if I were to do the brewing experiments, I found that the A lot of the THC actually stuck to the sides of the kettle in the same way that hop components stick to the kettle. You lose a lot of hops. And with the world of cannabis, THC is very expensive. And so, you do a 5-gallon homebrew with hop buds. You use about an ounce. And if you get to a dispensary here in Colorado, you'll see an ounce of buds can run, depending on the quality, anywhere from $100 to $200, maybe even $300 for an ounce of buds. That's a lot of money to spend for a 5-gallon batch and lose a lot of that THC in your kettle. So what we figured out is that the best way to do cannabis beer is to figure out a way to solubilize the oil into a water-soluble form and then put it into your liquid. And so we worked with a company that has that figured out. And by now there are several companies in the THC market that have figured out how to water solubilize the cannabinoids and allow them to go into liquids. So now you can certainly purchase water-soluble CBD, THC, and those are the main ones for now. But in the future...
Their general process is like attaching them to fats of some sort, or...
In general, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I can't say exactly the process because it is very proprietary.
It's all proprietary, sure.
Yeah,
sure.
And so, but you're right.
And each of those companies are very protective of their intellectual property around them.
Very protective.
Yeah.
So it's.
I get a fair number of pitches from them. Like, we'd love to talk to you about our, groundbreaking technology for creating water-soluble THC. But it is kind of a fascinating, piece of science to have that be able to remain in suspension.
Yeah, and really that's what it's all about, is to get that THC to go in solution and not come out of solution. So as an oil, obviously it would float to the top of your beer and really have no effect on your body unless you were to kind of consume that oil that's at the top. But then you're talking about dosage effects where you'd be consuming a big dose of that THC in that oil, versus if it were water soluble and dispersed throughout the liquid, then you get a nice homogeneous solution so that you consume the THC in entirety only when you've consumed the entire bottle.
I imagine the same concerns are right there where, making a beer that doesn't have large particles in it that will precipitate out is also important so that you're not dragging some of that THC down into the bottom of the can with as something might settle out before it's sold or while it's in somebody's refrigerator.
Oh, that's critical because you want the THC experience to be as consistent from batch to batch and bottle to bottle as possible. There are so many people in today's market that still have not tried cannabis, and they're afraid to, partially because of that fear of taking a big slug of it and all of a sudden getting stoned. And
right.
A lot of them might be in a social situation where they don't want to be stoned. They'd love to consume it, but know that they'll stay in control. And so that's a great segue to our philosophy at our company, is that we have low-dose products so that people stay in control and that they stay social and responsible. Because for us, it's beer. Beer is that beverage of moderation where you consume it, you socialize around it, you stay responsible, and most of all, you stay in control.
One of the things that's hit the news over the last couple of weeks are, obviously the issues with vape pens, but also bootleg CBD, certainly in states where some of these things are a little more challenged than they are here in Colorado. From your perspective, how do you evaluate, for example, these kinds of providers that are providing you with this water solubilized, products, and make sure that, again, what you're then delivering to an end consumer is what that consumer expects, and it's going to be healthy or as reasonably healthy as it can be, and also genuine and authentic.
Yeah, so it's I think it's important to note that you do have to have quality processes in place to avoid any type of these issues that we're seeing. And on top of that, another reason we need the three-tier system is exactly to avoid situations like this, because look down at Costa Rica, where we just had a spate of tourists who actually were killed from drinking poisonous alcohol. It was from the black market, and some of it contained methanol that killed people. Here in the States, you don't find that because we have a rigid three-tier system that prevents that. And if there was any type of incident, the army of people employed by the beer distributors, whether independent or big brewer owned, that army of people gets out to the market and pulls back any product that is or may be dangerous. In the cannabis world, that doesn't exist. And it's really critical.
Right. And you're right. The federal prohibition on it certainly creates conditions where there can't be federal oversight of these kinds of producers. And so there ends up being more black market stuff. As we all know, when you can legalize and regulate, tax, and build a system around regulating these kinds of things, you end up with greater consumer safety than you do in a kind of prohibition, everything's illegal, everything's run by the black market kind of environment. And the end result is more safety for consumers that way.
Exactly, and that's what it's all about: is giving products to consumers that are safe, as close as 100% safe as we can get. And to me, that's so critical to do that. And from my perspective, I'll source out the ingredients and make sure they're high quality from a reputable supplier, because there are some out there who are, their processes for quality aren't quite in place yet. So we deal with companies who really have high quality standards, and they can tell us exactly what's in the product. So they'll have what everybody knows as C of A's, certificates of analysis. And these are chemical analysis that are done on each batch, so you know exactly what's in there and what's not in there. And so you can actually use this and produce your products and make really good, high quality, safe products. And that's why in the black market, people don't care much about quality, and you end up with some suppliers that include ingredients that can actually make people sick or worse. And that's why I think we need this particular area, cannabis, to be federally legalized to prevent this type of activity in the future.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. Whether you use it or not, it's there is something about the legal approach of prohibition which doesn't make it better for anybody. Simply enables more crime and all the other negative effects that kind of come along with that, including damage and injury to individuals that do choose to use it potentially.
Right, and also you can regulate it, and besides the safety is actually from ingredients, you have the safety built into the dosages. So if it were federally regulated, you could actually have different classifications. For example, in the beer world, you've got a beverage of moderation, beers that are non-alcoholic up to strong beers, but in general, most beers are around 5 or 6% ABV. Then you've got wines, which are, in general, 12 to 15% ABV. And then you've got spirits, which are distilled spirits, and those are classified as spirits. They're very strong. In the world of cannabis, why not do the same type of general classifications where you've got low dose, kind of medium dose, and high dosed products? You kind of have that now in the states where it's legal with medical and then recreational. Recreational is, in general, THC content anywhere from a milligram up to 100 milligrams, and medical is over 100. So there's a general leaning towards that type of regulation, but I think we definitely need to make it more clear so that consumers can start to experiment with cannabis and know exactly how much they're taking and what they feel like, so that they can stay in control and kind of gauge, what kind of reaction they're going to have when they have a 5 milligram product or a 10 or a 20.
Yeah, and there are plenty of corollaries to alcohol there, as well. There are going to be people that enjoy this. There are people who want to try and realize that that's not the product for them. But what do you think the ultimate size of this market for cannabis-infused beer, cannabis kind of derived beverages in that kind of beer space, looks like? Is this obviously you're building a business around this, and you're putting some eggs in that basket. How big do you think it's going to be, and what do you look at as a timeline for this becoming the thing that it will become?
Well, I think the thing to keep in mind is that it is still federally illegal. So as long as it's federally illegal, I don't think the market will be as big as the beer market.
Yeah.
But once we see federal legalization, that's when I think it will explode. I think it's going to be really, really big. The big question is, is it going to be bigger than the beer market? And I don't think so, but at the same time, consumers don't know what they don't know. A lot of them aren't familiar that you can actually have a beer with cannabis. And most people see our product and they say, oh, it's alcohol plus cannabis. So there's so much education that has to go on. It's almost like at the beginning of the craft beer revolution, at least in the 90s. When I launched Blue Moon, I remember most people back then didn't think craft beer would be much more than 1% of the market.
Right.
But the Brewers Association got behind it and pushed and really helped grow it to, their goal was 20% by 2020. I think it kind of flattened out at around 12-ish, 13-ish percent of the market. But of course, there are some cities that are like Portland, Seattle, Denver, where craft beer is bigger than that. Other cities, it's less. But back then, in the 90s, nobody thought it would get that big. Cannabis right now, I think, is sitting right back then where craft brewers were sitting, where it's very small. It's growing for sure. Our products are growing. But the minute we see federal legalization, that'll be the true starting point where we'll see this thing explode. And we'll see people use cannabis for certain occasions where alcohol doesn't fit. And then, of course, alcohol will be in these other occasions where cannabis doesn't fit. And at the end of the day, you'll have drinks, whether alcoholic or cannabis, that have all of their occasions. And I think we'll still see a decrease in the amount of smokables in the cannabis market because it's not very social. And of course, the health implications are there. And just a lot of things about smoking that are kind of negative to a lot of people, whereas drinking has been part of
I like my lungs. I like to be able to breathe. Yeah,
most of us do.
A few things like that. Right. One question that before we close here, building a beer. I mean, the reason we have something called beer is because there were ingredients that were readily available to the people that started making those products in those kinds of places where beer originated, and it has become what it is because the stuff was there. It fermented in a certain way. There were natural yeasts that caused this kind of stuff to happen in the very earliest times of beer. And so the beverage developed and the flavors developed, based on what was possible and what was available. With something like cannabis, we're now kind of taking that same beer flavor that's comfortable that we're used to, and you are taking alcohol out, you are adding THC in for that beer experience that produces a different kind of psychoactive experience than alcohol. Is this idea of beer, infused then with cannabis, a bridge to something that's next, where there are different beverages that taste a different way because they are made with cannabis and because there is not necessarily the same kind of ingredient process to create alcohol that creates that flavor in beer? Is this a bridge, or do you think that there's something enduring about that flavor of beer that humans are attracted to that makes this, where this kind of cannabis-based beverage has the most opportunity?
I think at Ceria, we are initially thinking that the flavor of beer is what most consumers will look for. Cannabis has an aroma and a taste that can be quite polarizing, meaning you either like it or you don't. Whereas beer, there's so many different styles that have so many different flavor profiles that there are some that are polarizing, but in general, there's a beer out there for anybody. and we've heard, especially successful cicerones, talk about how they've convinced people who were known as non-beer drinkers to drink beer because they finally found something that they liked. With cannabis, it is, at least in my opinion, everything I've read, and as well as some testing, I believe cannabis is too polarizing to have purely cannabis products. For example, a beer that's dry hopped with cannabis, and you can smell the strain of Diesel or Kush or whatever strain you pick out, Girl Scout cookies. You can smell those, but I don't know that we'll ever get to the point. Maybe we will, but I don't think so, because beer can be made to taste like beer and have the effects of cannabis, which is what we do. We make sure we add just the THC and the CBD, but we avoid the aroma and taste of cannabis and focus on the great taste of craft beer.
That makes sense. Sounds like a good place to wrap up. Keith Villa, thanks for joining me here on the podcast.
Thanks, Jamie. Yeah, and I hope your listeners had a great time, because I sure did. And cheers to craft beer and brewing.
Thanks. Before we get out of here, I want to thank our sponsors on this episode. G&D Chillers sets the standard on quality, service, and reliability. Tavour is the tastiest way to explore the world from the comfort of your home. Country Monk Group understands the importance of excellent ingredients, and Clarion Lubricants is the best source for food-grade lubricants. Keith, are we going to see you at GABF next week rolling around Denver?
We will be there, not with Ceria, because this is actually the first year that the GABF is allowing non-alcoholic beers into the festival. Ceria was in the market too late to get a booth. However, we do have a second brewery it's an alcoholic brewery where we develop a lot of the recipes in an alcoholic form before de-alcoholizing. It's called Donovan Brewing in Arvada, Colorado. And Donovan will have a booth. We'll be serving a Vienna-style lager and a cinnamon horchata beer.
Well, we're looking forward to it. Should be a fantastic week. Welcome to Colorado, everyone that's making the trip out for the Great American Beer Festival. While you're here and you hit a dispensary somewhere in the Denver area, grab a can of Ceria Beverage and Grain Wave and try some of his THC-infused beer. Keith Villa, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks, Jamie.
Cheers. This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.